paid good money to see this movie. When they go out to a theater, they want cold sodas, hot popcorn, and no monsters in the projection booth.
Everyone pretend podcasting isn't boring.
Turn it off. Turn it off.
Hey folks, welcome to a special episode of The Projection Booth. I'm your host, Mike White. Last year we heard from Eric Hynes and Choi all about the First Look Film Festival from the Museum of the Moving Image. And here we are again to hear about the 2023 program. If you're in New York, you should really check this out, and regardless, I hope you enjoy the interview. It has been a year since we sat down and talked about the MoMI First Look Festival, and I am so curious to kind of catch up with you guys and hear how things have been over the last year, how last year's festival was, and then talk to you about this year's and what we have to look forward to. So, Edo, what's been going on, sir?
Well, last year's festival, I think, was a real success, and we're excited to be back this year and are really, really, I think, proud of this slate and the lineup of events that we have as part of working on it. I think it's going to be an exciting year.
Our turnout last year was the best we've ever had. And coming off the pandemic, that was not quite what we expected, but it certainly is exciting to be in a position of thinking about it growing in terms of both audience and in terms of what we're doing.
So how did this year's slate of films come together?
Well, we start pretty early in terms of watching. And because we're a year-round venue and we do programming all year round for various purposes, both for like kind of monthly programming and also, special series, things of that nature. And we both travel. I think we were starting with an eye towards programming at least as far back as Cannes of last year. And we have films from Cannes and, in a sense, have an eye on those things and then start kind of sending out feelers for the availability of films late summer and then start doing some actual invitations in the fall. So yeah, it goes way back in that respect, and we're not ever opposed to films even further back. Ideally we're looking at films from 2022 and 2023. And we don't have anything older than that. But even before Cannes, I was at Millennium Docs Against Gravity in Warsaw of early May of last year and came out with 2 films from that festival. So by being in March, we used to be in January. We're a little bit more in play in terms of this season's films. And you'll see that in terms of where some films have come from in terms of 2023 films. But that's not necessarily how we think of things. We're really looking to kind of just like what is not shown in New York, what can we introduce to the New York audience, and what can we maybe sort of get behind as we sort of try to, get behind films and filmmakers this stage. It's crazy to think of our purview being like that wide open in terms of an entire year, but it is, even though our festival is really compact in terms of 18 features and then a dozen or so shorts.
So other than the criteria of having not been shown in New York before, what makes a good first look film for you guys?
But we're always talking about that. And I think maybe we probably both have different angles on that in a way that we should. Yeah, I think, the notion of the title of the festival, First Look, predates us. It was, it was there from the very first year, but we've kind of run with that a little bit. And it being kind of obviously the first time showing in New York, but also like a first take on something, a way of making films or a way of approaching a genre that we haven't quite seen before, or also it being kind of early in a filmmaker's career. Not necessarily, but it could be like part of what we're embracing. And then also, as Edo mentioned, the working on it element, which is the daytimes of the first 3 days of the festival are all works in progress or discussions of the artistic process. And that's a first look too. You're really seeing it first. Often this is the first time that anything's ever left the editing suite and we're getting a chance to take a look at it. Yeah, that's kind of the guiding principle behind all of it. And I think that every film in the festival winds up being something that we consider in terms of the notion of how we might think of first look. And maybe I'm attracted to a particular film because I've never quite seen it before. And then maybe sometimes Edo is attracted to something because it is a fresh take on, maybe it's more classically told, but there's something new there, or it's the first time that a particular filmmaker or approach to filmmaking has been shown in a New York festival in a long time.
when you guys don't agree about something, how do you work it out? Is it knives, guns? I mean, like wrestling?
I think it's very peaceable. I mean, one way that we're different, I think, than other festivals, and I mean, obviously we're not a submissions festival, so we are very much, it's curated in terms of things that we found over the course of the year. But we're not, it's Edo and myself and Sonia Epstein, who's our science and on-screen curator, but also is sort of like going well beyond that in terms of films that she was considering and pushing forward this year. We're not voting. Obviously, we don't want to show a film that any one of us is really uncomfortable with, but there are films here that maybe one or two of us has a real passion for, right? And we go with that, like I think there was moments, and I don't want to go down to particular films, but there are films that maybe one of us maybe was not entirely sold on, but then the other one or two were basically like, but it just, these are the reasons it has to be there. And that wins out. Like, I'd rather have passion for a selection rather than there being kind of like somewhere down the middle.
I agree. This isn't quite to your point about how we settle disputes or disagreements around a certain film, but I think it relates to what Eric was also saying earlier about how we judge whether a film is eligible for a year's festival, because there are films that might be, I mean, particularly with some short films, I often find myself going a little bit further back in time. I'm interested not just in what's the latest, fresh off the presses work, but also what is just vital work that represents a practice ongoing by an artist or a filmmaker in this moment who maybe is undershown in North America or in New York or the East Coast or wherever, and whose work deserves to be kind of shown in a context like this and put before a New York audience for the first time. That becomes a real factor in whether I think something is not worthy of inclusion. I don't want to put it that way, but something that I'm attracted to including and that I want to put our full support behind.
Yeah, I mean, Edo does an experimental film programming year-round, an experimental film program that Edo and Becca Keating on staff work on. And for this year's festival, Edo put together 2 experimental programs. And as he's saying, really has a mind for introducing an artist that, as he said, maybe the films are 2 years old, but they haven't necessarily been presented in this context, and they haven't necessarily been presented alongside some other filmmakers that maybe have new works that people are familiar with the filmmakers, but they're not familiar with this other filmmaker. And that way of introducing films to particular audiences is something that I know he cares about.
You guys have been going out and going to all these film festivals, as you said. How is kind of the state of film festivals these days? It sounds like you're going to more in-person things. Obviously, we had a time where there were no in-person things. You're back in person, have been now. This is the second year. But how's the rest of the world as far as, coming back from the pandemic?
It sort of depends on the festival. There's some general trends we could speak to, but Edo just got back from Berlin, and I think his sense of Berlin this year to last is quite different.
I mean, last year Berlin was in person, but it was in person in a kind of emergency way. The festival schedule was reduced for professionals who were confined to the first 6 days. There was mandatory masking and testing for members of press each morning, and the theater seating was all very socially distanced, which means that they actually had to double the number of theaters they used for each press screening to fit a number of press into the house. And at the same time, attendance was much, much lower because very few people actually were able to make it to the festival or found it useful to make it under such kind of Spartan conditions. So this year was a real change. I mean, it felt like I was experiencing Berlin for the first time in a lot of ways, because last year was my first year going to that festival, but this year felt like a real addition. And it was reflected in the number of people, but also in the sense of excitement around the events, and of course the evening gatherings and parties that would attend them, which none of which happened last year. And I do think that more or less international festivals are kind of back to where they were, or they're attempting to project that they're back to where they were, and they're attempting to get those audiences and professional communities back.
And that's certainly the way that Cannes approached things last year, where the idea behind that is that they're fully back. And yeah, I wouldn't say that it was back to the levels of attendance for 2019, say, but it was, I mean, it didn't feel like threadbare, that's for sure. There's certainly a lot of money being spent both on the festival and taking away from the festival. Whereas a festival like Sundance, which had 2 years of being fully online, and this year went hybrid, I was there on the ground, and there was definitely, a significant reduction in audience. And I'm very curious about how they're going to handle that going forward, if they're going to remain hybrid or if they're going to shift more towards in-person. But yeah, it felt a little bit like they're just getting their legs back, whereas another festival like Cannes seemed like they were back as of 2022. So, and then I would say, just not to spend too long, because I'm sure you have other questions, but in terms of some of the smaller regional festivals, I think that they bounced back a little bit more forcefully. If like community like Camden in Maine or True False in Colombia, it felt like those festivals were really kind of coming back because they're so community based. If the community is behind that festival, then it can go back to its proper state.
So I'm the kind of a person that I don't watch previews. I just am fine going in blind to stuff, but not everybody is, and definitely not all of my listeners. So tell me some of the films that have really excited you. Of course, all of them are going to be great, but I'm curious as far as personally, what are the ones that are really exciting you for this year?
For the first time ever, we have 3 titles that premiered at Sundance. And so we're kind of the next stop for these films. So like our opening night film, Fremont, is my favorite film out of Sundance. And that was in the next section. And that almost like a classic 1980s American independent film, but with the slant of being kind of told from a recent immigrant's point of view, which is not necessarily where, like, say, Jim Jarmusch film from 1983 would have positioned things. And it's very self-consciously, I think, or consciously using some of that language, but to a different end, and something more comedic, and kind of putting immigrant communities in a story where they may normally be in the periphery, but they're actually quite central. And it's surprisingly very funny too. So that film's I'm pretty crazy about. And then, we basically have each night of the festival, we have a showcase screening where we kind of put an extra spotlight on a film in our big theater, the Redstone. And so we have films like Fremont, and then Rodeo, which premiered at Cannes, and that's got a really scrappy genre thriller, even leans into sci-fi to some degree, film that I was sort of shocked was not bigger deal out of Cannes, and it actually opens theatrically right after it screens with our festival. A film called The Taste of Mango, which is Chloe Abraham's first feature that just premiered at True False, so we'll be the second stop for that film, and that's a personal film about her mother and grandmother from Sri Lanka. And then a film that premiered at Rotterdam called New Strains. I think we're the second stop for that film too. That's a New York film sort of inspired by the pandemic, shot during the pandemic, but very, very funny, sort of standard def indie film. And then the closing night film, Mami Wata, which is another Sundance film, which won cinematography prize. And that is an absolutely distinctive West African film that looks and plays like a fable, but then also has some clear present day elements and overtures. So I'll stop there and let Edo put a couple titles out there.
And all those films I just want to add, are crowd pleasers, which I think is really nice that it turned out this way. It's not that we try to get crowd pleasers or films that hit in a more, let's say, direct way for those slots, but it's nice that it kind of naturally turned out that way, and in very different ways.
I was going to say, they're very diverse among the 5 of them.
Since Eric focused on the showcase films, I'll focus on some of the documentaries and avant-garde films. I think one really quite important film that I'm very, very proud we're showing is a film from Senegal. Actually, it's kind of Senegalese, and then in a kind of unofficial way, a Mauritanian film by a Senegalese filmmaker named Alassane Diago. And sadly, Alassane won't be able to join us because his visa was denied by the United States government. But the film documents a meeting of survivors and refugees in Senegal from the late 80s, early 90s mass expulsion of Black Mauritanians that was undertaken by the Arab-controlled government of Mauritania. All these people were forced from their home country, their homeland, and forced to migrate, or just physically ejected from the country and sent to Senegal under the cover of a border war that was at the same time ongoing between the two countries. But what it really was an attempt by the Mauritanian government at that time to ethnically cleanse the region of Black Mauritanians in particular. It's an undercovered story, a not particularly visible story that the film addresses in a way that's not towards a Western audience. It's towards the audience of those people affected by these events, and enacts a kind of truth and reconciliation process as we hear in this meeting of the different accounts of various survivors of this atrocity that was carried out. And it's very simple, very quiet, very durational film. And it's exactly the kind of documentary I like us to have at first look. Another film that I really love is one of the Sundance premieres that Eric mentioned. It's Mike Givisser and Mary Helena Clark's A Common Sequence, which was in the New Frontiers section at Sundance, along with two other experimental features. And it's a difficult film to describe, but I think the best way to put it is that it's an essay film on a range of themes having to do with the extraction of information and knowledge from the natural world, either from animals or plants or crops, or even extending to our own genetic information. And the way in which this knowledge then becomes exploitable for the purposes of commercial enterprise or military uses or other forms of utilitarian and self-interested control, let's say. And the film explores this in a very compellingly lucid fashion through case studies in 3 different parts of the world. So one is a small fishing village in Mexico, and then another are the apple orchards in the northwest of America, and then again on the Native American reservation lands in the Dakotas. And through these cases, ultimately reaches some kind of relational framework that makes all of these spaces start to feel connected in an odd way that's not visible. And so for me, what's powerful about this work is that it attempts through mostly a direct observational documentary format to depict things that actually we can't see. And I think that that's a very brave and difficult thing for a movie to undertake.
I know you're more into some experimental stuff as well. Can you tell me a little bit about the experimental programs you put together?
It was 2 shorts programs this year, which we also did last year and the year before that. Programs are responses to what I felt was the most exciting work that I watched. And as Eric mentioned earlier, we don't have official public submissions process. So most of these films are films that I'm requesting to see of artists who are working, artists that I'm familiar with, or artists that I find through research of other festival lineups, or films that I've been lucky enough to see at other festivals. And so I think the themes of these 2 programs that have emerged are specifically related to me finding ways to respond to what the filmmakers were interested in. So in the case of the first program, they're all American films, or rather North American films. There's a couple Canadian films. And they're all films that are reflecting on, let's say, the American landscape in some way or other, often in a humorous way, sometimes in a slightly eerie or haunting way. And I felt that they all spoke to each other in ways that are surprising and contrasting. And I think that that's what makes a good program, is if it doesn't become too intellectual, if it's just more like rhythmic or harmonic relational beats or dissonances. And that's similar to the second program, which is, as it happens, almost entirely non-American films. In fact, I think it's entirely non-American films, which relate to each other in, again, these kind of more purely rhythmic or tonal ways. And I like to put things together that way because the ethic of it is not really to produce thesis linking a number of films. The ethic is to try to create a composed experience that will actually excite and entertain and hopefully wow an audience. And I think these films do that. They're very, very beautiful, all of them.
As you guys are going out to all these different festivals and seeing so many movies and then kind of bringing home all of these for first look, I mean, are you seeing themes? Are you seeing, particular topics being brought up again and again? I mean, I know last year there was so much concentration on the Ukraine war, which unfortunately I'm not seeing as much, but, of course, Ukrainian filmmakers have other things on their mind right now. But, what are you seeing as far as out there in the world? And then specifically, I know, Eric, you mentioned that there are some real crowd pleasers this year. And I wonder if we're kind of going back to like, not necessarily the lighter and fluffier things because they're very challenging films, but having some sort of hope for the future.
It's not that films from the Ukraine right now are turning away from the war. There are many films that are actually dealing with the current conflict, I think, in very exciting and serious ways. And we tried to actually, Eric can speak to this. There were a number of films we were interested in programming, some we just didn't get. I think that there are films out there. And then last year, I'll just say that, we programmed that festival before the conflict began. And so the films that spoke to the region and the political conditions in that region that have led to this conflict, we were just responding to what the artists were surfacing.
Yeah, and we do have two films this year from Ukraine, or I would say one from Ukraine, one addressing the situation. One is a film that was shot just before, or in the years before, this new era of the conflict, called Three Women, and that's set in a sort of Western, sort of remote area in the Carpathians that seems very far away from that situation, but is actually really moving to kind of visit that space and that space in the kind of moments before things really, really changing everywhere for that country. Another short film, which we're actually showing as part of our opening night presentation, called Away, and that's from a Belarusian filmmaker, Ruslan Fedotov, and that's set in Budapest, where there are refugees from the conflict, young people. The two main characters are teenagers, and they also spend time with very young children who are kind of working through their own trauma. Really fantastic observational film. The other major theme of the year that I'm seeing, which I think is somewhat telling of there being several years of the pandemic, although it's probably also just the fact that some of these films take a long time to make, and there happened to be just coincidentally that they've arrived in 2023. And we have a representation of one of these, which is The Taste of Mango, which I mentioned before, by Chloe Abrams, which are sort of first-person, borderline home movies with young female protagonists addressing generations of either generations of trauma or generations of immigration. And so, I just came from True False, where there were basically 3 or 4 films in this mold. There was Taste of Mango. There's a Junam, which premiered at Sundance. There's Militesando, a South African film that also premiered at Sundance. There's Hummingbirds, an Mexican-American film that just premiered at Berlin that they had. And so there was really undeniable that was a real theme. I also loved that True False programmed all of these films. What sometimes can happen at a festival is that they feel like they need to sort of cover their bases, and they wind up kind of turning down fantastic films because maybe it's too similar to something else in their program. True False doesn't care about that, and we don't care about that either. It's kind of how, even though we had 18 features, we wound up with 4 or 5 films that were, either set in or by Ukrainian film, set in Ukraine or by Ukrainian filmmakers last year. That was we were responding to what was powerful and vital in that moment. So, I will say, just in terms of your question about where things are at festival wise, I do think we're seeing that, and that's great. It's whether it's coincidental or because of the era that we've come out of. But also, and one last thing was the idea was, I think our idea of crowd pleasing might be a little bit different than other festivals. The idea of crowd pleasing, there are films that I think that in terms of like our sense of crowd pleasing, is that I do think that there's maybe a wider spectrum of our audience or New York audience that can find a way in to some of these films. They're not quite the same thing as what's going to be playing at the multiplex on this weekend, but we hope that's exactly why it's appealing to people.
And Edo, I know you mentioned that there was the Senegalese filmmaker who was unable to attend this year, but can you tell me about some of the other filmmakers who will be in attendance?
We're very lucky that actually several of the filmmakers are local this year. So Chloe Abrams lives between New York and London and is in New York right now. So she'll be joining us with Taste of Mango. And Mary Helena Clark lives in New York, so she'll be on hand for Common Sequence along with her co-director, Mike Gibisser, who will be flying in from Wisconsin. And then the New Strains team, the co-directors Artemis Shaw and Prashanth Kamalakanthan, they will be joining us. Both of them live in New York. So I'm very happy that that's worked out. I also do want to mention that you had asked about the Persistent Visions experimental shorts programs, and we're very lucky for the first time to have, for the first program, every film represented by one of its filmmakers. So the only filmmaker who will not be able to attend is Kevin Jerome Everson, but every film, including Kevin's film, which was co-directed with Cladrina Harold as part of their Blackfire project. Cladrina will be in attendance, and all the other films will have their filmmakers with them. So we're really pleased about that.
Obviously, each of the showcase films will have folks attending. So Babak Jalali is actually coming in from London, and star Anaita Alizada will also be there. Ruslan Fedotov, who's been based in Hungary, will be there for opening night. The director of Rhodiola the Quivoron will be joining us from France. So and on and on and on. In fact, most of the films have talent attending. There's only a few really where we weren't able to get folks to come. I think then CJ Fiery Obasi, the director of Mami Wata, will be coming from Nigeria. I think he's the one who's coming from the furthest distance. Iwelina Rozinska is coming from Poland. One of three filmmakers actually coming from Poland. So yeah, we're doing well in terms of bringing folks in. That's kind of like one of our main priorities, honestly, is like any money that we have for this festival, either that we raise or that we put aside for it, we put towards bringing filmmakers in and putting them up, because it's a festival that, it's certainly not kind of well-financed festival like a Sundance or a Tribeca or something like that, but it is. So therefore, the entirety of its spirit really comes down to having people in the room and having filmmakers in the room with each other. And that's one of the reasons why we started that Work in Progress series, was because filmmakers wanted to be there and they wanted to be a part of it. And they were just simply hanging around even after their films to either watch each other's films or get a drink. And so, if you're going to be here and you're attentive to one another, why don't you actually help each other out a little bit too and look at some cuts? So yeah, the fact that we're bringing in so many folks is great, but that's always strong preference, because it all happens in our venue and because our audiences are used to engaging with filmmakers and talking about process. Like Edo and I think about process a lot, and I think as a result, the conversations we have with filmmakers winds up focusing a lot on process. So I think that our audience feels like these filmmakers are available to them, that we have like more extended conversations after the films than a lot of festivals do. And because they are staying local, those conversations kind of spill out into the lobby and maybe kind of continue over the course of those days. That's sort of, I think, kind of the appeal for filmmakers as well, is that it's not the sort of place where you're getting shuttled from one place to the next and one venue to the next and one fancy party to the next. Like our parties are pretty much either in our building or at a local bar, and you really get a chance to sort of be a part of the Astoria community while you're here.
All right. Well, once again, the festival runs from March 15th to 19th, 2023. In case you're listening to this in the future, you can find out all of the available details over at movingimage.us. Passes are available, I imagine, because that's the best way to go to a festival is buy a pass, go in and enjoy. So thank you so much, Eric and Edo. I look forward to talking with you guys again next year, if not sooner.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you so much, Mike.